Okay, guys, today it's labor issues and conflict. Pay close attention, not everything is written on the slides. First of all, the responses to conflict during this time period was to form unions. Skilled artisans were alarmed at the 1870 census report that a majority of employed persons worked for wages paid by others rather than work for themselves. So they began to seek to regain some of their independence. Okay, in 1866, leaders of several craft unions had formed the National Labor Union. Labor parties began to spring up and were somewhat successful in state elections, but had minimal success outside of that. There was a lot of pressure in Congress, and so they began to put pressure on Congress, led to the establishment of the 1884 creation of the Bureau of Labor. Now, the Bureau of Labor became a cabinet position in 1903. In 1894, Labor Day, it was established as an official holiday to honor working people. So the National Labor Union is going to lose some of its control by the 1870s, but violence is going to be on the rise. So that brings us to the railroad strike, 1877. Citing declining revenue after the Panic of 1873, several railroads cut wages by about 35%. Now, July 16, 1877, the Baltimore and Ohio made its third cut in a row, and workers began to strike. They spread, and this strike led to other railroad lines. Traffic from St. Louis to the East Coast halted. 10 states called out militias. Strikers and militias fired at each other. Workers set fire to rail stock and roadhouses. By August, federal troops had gained control, but about 100 strikers, militiamen, and others were killed, and even more were injured. There was millions of dollars in property damage. Now, labor unions began to take more and more control or more influence, and we have the Knights of Labor. Knights of Labor, Philadelphia, 1869. Its leader is Terence Powderly. It began as a secret fraternal society. In 1879, they abandoned the secrecy and became known as a Federation of Assemblies. Now, organized by industry, not craft, unskilled and semi-skilled workers were represented, some women and some blacks as well. Their goals were higher wages, shorter hours, and better conditions. Now, their methods, they used collective bargaining and strikes. Knights of Labor and Terence Powderly both discouraged the strikes, felt like a failed strike dismantled the assembly, and employers would be replacing strikers and scabs. So they desired that workers work in cooperatives on their means of production. Lack of capital and management experience led to limited success of the Knights of Labor co-ops. Skilled craftsmen struggled to keep up with the machines, and so began to fall further and further behind. So despite discouraging strikes, the Knights of Labor had their greatest success as the result of a strike. Now, the Haymarket riots, what happened, the Socialist Labor Party was rising in power, and their goals were not always consistent, really, within the party, and so they weren't always united. One element of the party, they embraced anarchism. Anarchists infiltrated the labor unions, and that became a major problem because those guys were much more violent. So we have the Haymarket riot. May of 1886, the national movement centered in Chicago for an 8-hour workday. May 1st, 1886, McCormick Farm Machinery Plant in Chicago. They began having issues there and some rioting there. May 3rd, the police intervened in a outside the gates, in a fight outside the gates. 4 were killed there. By May 4th, anarchists were protesting at Haymarket Square, and when the crowd was dispersing, someone threw a bomb and the police began opening fire. No one knows how this happened or who did what, but 50 were wounded, 10 dead, and 6 of those were officers. The reaction to the Haymarket was mass hysteria, and it was against the labor radicals. Police in Chicago rounded up the labor leaders. 8 anarchists, most of them German-born, or 7 of them were German-born, went on trial for conspiracy to commit murder. There was no evidence that any of them had thrown the bomb. All 8 were convicted. 7 were sentenced to hang. 1 man committed suicide, and the governor commuted the sentence of 2 and to a life in prison. The remaining 4 hanged on November 11th, 1887. The case was extremely controversial, and some to refer to the case as judicial murder. Majority of Americans applauded the repression of anti-American radicalism. Now, you're going to have the Knights of Labor catching the backlash. Even though they had nothing to do with it, Powderly denounced the anarchism. He opposed the wage system, so many Americans viewed him as a socialist, perhaps bordering on anarchist, and the membership in the Knights of Labor declined. It was 700,000 in 1886, and it declined to less than 100,000 by 1890. This will give rise to the American Federation of Labor in 1886. Loosely affiliated association of unions organized by trade or craft. Their leader is Samuel Gompers. The AFL accepted capitalism and the wage system, but they did work for better conditions, higher wages, shorter hours, and improved safety. Most of their members are going to be skilled laborers. Now, another strike is the Homestead Strike, 1892, at the Homestead plant near Pittsburgh. It was a part of Carnegie Steel Company. Carnegie and the plant manager, Henry Clay Frick, wanted to break the power of the union, the Amalgamated Association of Iron, Steel, and Tin Workers. Frick used a dispute over wages to work rules as an opportunity to close the plant. This is a lockout. It's a way for plant owners to end work and force bargaining or to get their way. And so preparing to reopen with non-union labor is what Frick wanted to do. Now, the union called a strike and refused to leave. And so Frick calls in 300 guards. These are called Pinkerton guards. They're hired hands. It's a private security organization specializing in non-union activity. Now, July 6th, shots are fired between the Pinkertons and the strikers. 9 dead, many wounded. Frick turns to the government and persuades action. He gets 8,000 militia sent to protect the strike breakers. And the plant reopens. The public had sympathized with unions, but that shifted when anarchists tried to murder Frick on July 23rd. The Homestead Strike failed and basically crippled the Amalgamated Association and was quite ineffective. Now, between 1893 and 1897, the country experiences this depression, and the nation's working class is suffering, and let's face it, everyone is suffering. So protests are going to continue, and one of these results in Coxey's army. It was one of several armies that would march on Washington. And although Coxey's army was only one of more than 40 different armies of the unemployed that headed for D.C. in 1894 to seek relief from their plight, it was by far the best known. Its leader was the colorful Jacob S. Coxey, a wealthy populist who owned a sand quarry, bred horses, and wore hand-tailored suits. The publicity that preceded the arrival of the armies apparently frightened authorities. 1,500 soldiers were stationed in Washington to meet the army. Thousands more were available in Baltimore. The army numbered only 500. When Coxey tried to speak at the U.S. Capitol, the police arrested him for walking on the grass. It was 50 years later that he actually got to make his speech, and if you visit the website that I've marked here, you can see the contents of that speech. But this is, the first March on Washington, major political protest. Another strike is the Pullman Strike, 1894. George M. Pullman, sleeping cars and rolling stock for the railroad is what they specialized in. It was south of Chicago. Manufacturing company workers lived in company housing with paved streets, clean parks, decent house. Pullman had control, though, and he banned liquor and he punished workers who did not meet the rules of decorum within his Pullman society. Now, the Panic of 1893 caused a drop in orders for Pullman cars, and the company laid off 1/3 of its workforce and cut wages by 30%. But that did not reduce rent for company housing or reduce the cost of items in the company store. Pullman refuses to negotiate, and workers call a strike and appeal to the American Railway Union. Now, the American Railway Union was founded by Eugene Debs. George Pullman refused their offer, the ARU's offer, to arbitrate the strike, and Debs launched a boycott by which the ARU members would refuse to run any trains of the Pullman cars. So the railroad company attempted to fire all ARU strikers, and whole crews would go on strike. It paralyzed rail traffic. This is when the president gets involved. President Grover Cleveland sent in federal troops to put down the strike and make it stop, but violence was the reaction. Okay, the U.S. Attorney General, a former railroad lawyer, obtained a federal injunction against Debs under the Sherman Antitrust Act. The grounds, the boycott and the strikes were a conspiracy in restraint of trade. It was creative use of the act, and its purpose was to curb corporations. So the Supreme Court upheld the use of this in 1895, and the Sherman Antitrust Act becomes a very powerful tool. July of 1894, after a week-long violent period, the Chicago rail yard resembled a war zone. Millions of dollars of equipment had been burned, 34 people were dead, and 14,000 state militia and federal troops were there to restore order. Debs ends up going to jail for a violation of a federal injunction and spends 6 months there. Now, America is in transition in the late 1800s, at the turn of the century, and this is not going to be peaceful. It's not going to be over. Okay, you'll see Sherman Antitrust Act, extremely powerful piece of legislation that is even used today. And do go back, review this PowerPoint so that you can review for your test. You will see some of this on there. I know it's quick, I know it's to the point, but take your time, do what you got to do, and study hard. Thanks a bunch.